This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Today is Sunday, March the 22nd, 2020, and this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, conservation, and all the other things that Dave's been up to.
We've been trying to sanitize things so that I don't become a danger to the rest of the world. But I wanted to introduce spring and to take you to the Pocket Prairie, which has been located to the detention pond on 2nd Street. I'll deal with both the pond itself, which I think is rather attractive and multiply used, as well as the Pocket Prairie. The detention pond is on the boneyard. It is an offshoot from the boneyard. The intent is to create a large pond where stormwater can accumulate and be let out slowly. That prevents the neighborhood from being flooded, and it was a serious problem. The boneyard originates way up near 74 and further north, and part of it is already channeled off to a circumventing channel that goes to a tributary to the east, and that was an attempt to reduce flooding. The old channel is channelized. That means it straightens, so water would get off fast. This was a very wet county, and it had to be drained before it could be utilized for agriculture. So we'll probably put a map in here when we change this to a video program and indicate that the pond itself starts at University Avenue and goes through to Springfield. And then there's another Park District area south of that, which is quite nice and related. Both areas have prairie on their trails, and the attempt there is to remind people of their heritage ecosystem, which is almost extinct. So the Pocket Prairie plants join an existing ecology, but they also increase the biodiversity some. We'll give you a map there. We'll give you a picture of the standing at the Springfield end and looking north. There is a larger pond nearer to the Springfield end, and then there's White Street, which crosses the pond area, and beyond that there's a smaller pond, and that's where our prairie is located. We put it there in kind of a natural setting so that people get an idea of how it looked, and we will hope to put it some signs there to indicate to people what we're talking about. There's an interesting sign on the Park District area south of Springfield. The pocket prairie elements were planted in 3 different situations. The first is a little higher and drier, and it's doing very well. Prairie plants adapt to a swampy situation, but they have to breathe. And the detention pond has often accumulated quite an amount of water that rather waterlogs the plants. There are other sites that are a little damper, but they're still doing well. And there's one site in the middle which is quite permanently waterlogged, and that will be used for wetland plants. And if you watch the video side of things, you get an idea of that site. The dry plants like little blue stem really don't enjoy a lot of water, but they're surviving. If they are challenged too much, they will become annuals, and then they'll have to be planted each year. But the grasses are relatively aggressive, so we don't encourage too many grasses, because the broadleaf plants are rich and interesting. There are some other limitations. The landscaping of the detention pond is used as a lawn area, and the trees are interspersed as independent trees and shrubs. So the shade that we had at the pocket prairie with trees has not had a counterpart in the dig. So shade-loving plants have lost out. Bloodroot and ginger and some others are not so excited by an excess of light. Other plants do quite well. There's a weed problem. That's always the case when you create a reconstruction prairie. The soil is disturbed, and the weed seeds that are there will come forth. We usually mow a new prairie. That's not really possible here, because some of our broadleaf plants are quite tall and could be destroyed by mowing. But also we like to leave some of the stems of last year so we know where our plants are. Later, as plants grow, there's a possibility that we can remove some of that natural litter that is not very aesthetic for people who are used to formal gardens. But for the specialist, the plants retire and die and fall with character, and it's an aesthetic thing for them to know that blue stem falls like a bunch of skittles, and other plants remain standing. So and they stand in a different way. So that's interesting, and we like to interpret that for people. We hope to have a sign there that will give some of this information. Some of the larger plants that we had that had been growing for many years on the pocket prairie did not survive. We had a huge lead plant with a counterpart set of roots that spread for a diameter of about 6 feet, and a dock plant that had 5 and 6 fruiting bodies that were up to 15 feet tall, and a baptisia that had pods, numerous pods, and it too has not survived. But we've left the structures there for the birds to use, and they also a credential for the volunteers who worked hard to try and save those plants. We're hoping that the seed in the soil and will bring forth replacements. The soil that they're going into is very clay, which is sort of sensible if you're wanting to have a detention pond and you don't want it to leak. But it's not very inviting for the roots of prairie plants that are quite considerable. The surrounding pathways are replete with simple prairies, but they're there and give character, and some of them stay up over winter, and some of them fall naturally. When in summer, in June and July, they create an interesting array, and as they go into the fall, the grasses tend to wave their wooden leg in the air and be interesting. We will remove some of the litter because this is a public place, and the ecosystem is rich enough in plants to give people an idea of what a prairie is about. But not everyone realizes that, so we do need to do some signage, and also to have some events associated with those plots. We need to work with maintenance crews that are quite sympathetic, but when plants fall over, they don't really create an interesting formal garden situation, so we have to deal with that. There are pollinator plots around the upper reaches of the detention pond, and they include prairie, but they also include cultivars or plants that have been cultivated and bred. So some of the plants that are there, like purple cornflower, flower for a longer period of time, are more expressive in terms of color, and we separate. The two sites are separated, but they sort of play on each other, and we appreciate the pollinator efforts because bees are having a hard time, and the world is dependent on them for pollination and of the vegetables and fruit crops that we are dependent on if we're going to have food. At the university end of the detention pond, there is a different style of landscaping. It's rather professional landscaping, but it includes some of the same cultivated plants that the pollinator people use. And they're planted in banks, and those banks give character, and so this is a professionally oriented pond. It sits atop of the pipe that brings the boneyard under the University Avenue. At that point, the boneyard is hidden, and this rather a formal landscape site is sitting on top of a hidden river. The plants that are there are fairly able to look after themselves. Some are a little more gentle. The water for this area comes from the street. The street slopes up a little, and when it rains, the area is watered. When it's dry in summer, I am a little sad for cardinal flowers that I know that love water. The iris seem to survive, but all in all, the shrubs and trees are integrated, and it's a rather nice situation. It's very close to a viewing place. As the boneyard comes out and expresses itself again, you can stand at the small, professionally landscaped prairie and look over to see the boneyard as it takes its run. It falls down, and as it falls, it runs over landscaping, and you can see the excitement of the water, which is often augmented by netting organizations that have nets that catch bacteria and other microorganisms. So the front of these little waterfalls are interesting. The stones that are used are sedimentary rocks. In east central Illinois in Champaign County, there wasn't a lot of that sort of stone. It's, however, cheaper to use and easier to sculpt with than the well-worn, rounded boulders that are glacial erratics. These were stones that dropped out as glaciers came from Canada, and as they were held in the ice, they were sometimes scraped across the landscape, so their flat side would be striated. But that sort of boulder has been included in the boneyard itself, and the river has to move around it. So to sit on the sedimentary rocks, which are often water-worn, and limestones or shales or sandstones, and those blocks give people a place to be, and animals a place to hide. there are modest meanders in the ditch, which are a recognition that rivers usually didn't run straight. They ran in a meandering fashion, so you have sigmoid curves, and if you don't do that, the river will cut in one side and dump on the other, and that's happening to a little extent, but the placement of boulders in key places keeps the stream relatively straight. Before I go too much further, I want to go back a little bit to the old boneyard to the north. There's a boys' club and a armory, a National Guard armory, and so some of the people that have been in this community for many years are also a part of this complex. The formal garden that's on University Avenue has tables and umbrellas and seats, and people from the North End can enjoy, along with other people that come and drive into parking places. Sometimes after work, there's a retinue of vehicles there, people coming in to enjoy this area. I walk past these places, and it's amazing what can be fit into odd shapes. There'll be a tree almost on top of a building. There will be a landscaping where you know that the designer was helpful. As you look over the boneyard to the south, there's a conversation area, and I look at it, and the way it is worked is just a credit to both the designer and the people who installed the concrete area. I'm kind of amazed. Sometimes we get field trips. In some cases, we've had a nearby Black History mural, and we take people to that. Going back to the south end, we encounter a deeper pond. It's south of the White Street. It crosses the two ponds and divides them. And there is a little bit of depth, and it's a place where ducks and geese and herons and occasionally a crow. There might be more crows. Sometimes they like to tease the other animals. If you stand there and be still for long enough, a goose will come up and peck your shoe just to check out whether it's good for food, and then they'll back away just a little bit and turn their head on side and look at you with one eye, and you have to know that that is part looking for food, but also it's registering friendship. The geese are not popular because they graze the areas of lawn and then defecate on the pathway, and that has been a major problem for people doing parks and recreation places, because the geese are very fecund. They breed and have large families, and at times of the year, if you happen to get between the goslings and the parents, then you are in dangerous situation, and they can be rather aggressive, and that frightens people. They're reasonably large animals, but there they sit with on the pathway sometimes. They sit in groups. The geese are usually in pairs because they're married for life, but then they decide to move somewhere, and often it's to the roof of a building nearby, which is sort of a niche from which they talk to each other and talk to their counterparts, and sometimes they all lift off together to go to other fields of food, and then come back in the evening and slowly fall into the glide into the water and land in a wonderful way, with perhaps their feet a little out to form a break. I'm mindful of flying planes that have the same problem. They have to land on water, and they have to be very careful as they come in. I was next to a goose, and it was talking to its mate, and the mate was on the other side of the park. And sure, they got together rather quickly, because I was a little bit of an invasive situation. They minded me, and to some extent they're docile because people do feed them. It's not very helpful for people to feed wild animals, but it happens, and then when it doesn't happen, they can be a little aggressive. There are 3 white ducks at the moment, and they have a hybrid associate that is a duck that's very jet black. It's a strange association, and but they're together and they talk to each other in a different way, and then they settle down, sometimes on the trail. There was the other day when I was there was a crow in the tree, and it was giving a goose a hard time. And crows are rather intelligent creatures, but people who are bird watchers have been watching this pond because there are not only waterfowls, but there are a number of other migratory birds, and it's an interesting place to be. You can walk across White Street and lean against the fence and look at the territory. There's a pump that pumps the water out if necessary, but it also pumps to aerate the water and make it healthy. And there's one spray in the pond itself, and the wildlife gambles around it. They enjoy the spray, and so just observing is good. Just to watch the trees themselves have interest. The way they branch. Some of them have burls. A burl is like a lump of wood that's been encouraged by perhaps a rubbing of another limb or something like that. But these are the burls that people cut off and make into bowls. They carve them out. The shrubs are interesting at the moment. Some are already blooming, and spring is here. It started on the 19th, and we're well there now. The fear is that when you have a spring coming, that there will be a late frost, and that can do damage to plants that have already flowered. So we hope that doesn't happen, but it has been cool the last few days. At the south end, there's history. There is the remnants of a bridge, which was a railroad that connected Urbana with Champaign. The railroad came through Champaign for various reasons, probably mostly because of the morainic situation, the geology. But it's a number of miles from Urbana, and Urbana had to have some way of transporting people and goods between West Champaign, which is now Champaign, West Urbana, which is now Champaign. And so a horse-drawn railroad allowed this interaction. Mr. McKinley, when he took over, realized that electricity could be useful. He electrified that railroad line, but it got to Wright Street and didn't get to extend to Urbana for a while, because Urbana is a different city than Champaign. Champaign is much more commercial, and that's been there for a long time. Across the road is Scott Park, named after a previous mayor of Champaign, and sitting in Midtown. There has been a distance between Old Town Champaign and the campus of the university. There's been an area that hasn't been developed very well, so there's been a move to create midtown plazas, and some of those plazas look directly over the Big Dig, which is the common name for the detention pond. And I'm sure those apartments sell well, and they have good viewing space. A lot of people use those pathways, and they're amazed to see a heron sitting there, still and waiting to pick up a morsel of food. And I suspect that the ponds encouraged by the provision of fingerling fish, and it's a place where people get together. Hikers and bikers can move fast or slow depending on what they want to do. The Scott Park area is rather wonderful because the volunteers and Park District got together and planted a quite biodiverse banks to the boneyard, and even included rain gardens and an element of statue here and there. It's a place where you can actually introduce people to various prairie plants. So we enjoy that. Yeah. The boneyard, once again, gets covered. A tributary from the south comes in, and 2 8-foot or very tall pipes allow the corridor to move through campus town. It opens up as with the engineering area, and then is open and in some places closed all the way to Urbana, where it was part of the early settlement of Urbana. And like in other situations, it has been moved. So people like Dennis Roberts on the city council are very interested in creating a corridor along that boneyard section to give it more life and wonder. And the area next on Broadway has recently been developed so that you can find your way in and around the boneyard and under the railroad bridges that went with the Big Four, and there's now the Norfolk Southern. There's a cemetery there that has a little Greek Revival cottage on it. It was closed in 1903 and the gravestones turned down, or you took your relatives' remains to another cemetery. We brought in a Greek Revival cottage that was near to University High School. The building was one of those buildings that was probably occupied by well-educated people that came here in the 1840s, 50s, and lived there till they got enough money to be able to put up a larger establishment, and that small house that they came as settlers was dragged across the snow in winter to a place near the then very early university. It looked over the boneyard. More recently, it became a challenge because the Granger Library needed a parking place, and the building was likely to be destroyed. So we worked with various agencies and got it to be transported down Springfield Avenue to Wright Street, and then up Wright Street to University, and along University to Lille Park, where it is today. It was an interesting experience. It still is. We were encouraged to leave the soil intact because we wanted to put in a basement that would allow for the storage of historic items and things like that. But once the house was tugged across this area and rested on prefabricated foundations, we had to dig out the internal soil, and we came across graves. So we had to have the coroner to come and the archaeology department, and the part of the problem was that 2 Indians were buried there, and you don't mess with Indian graves, but this was a Caucasian grave and with a shroud and a funereal coffin and things like that. So whatever bones are stored within the framework of the university in case they are ever to be researched. Yeah. So around the detention pond, there is history, there is practicality. Some of the western drainage that comes from the Champaign Moraine was causing drainage problems west of Prospect Avenue, and some of that water has been channeled into the drainage district, and the detention pond. So I encourage you to go and look at the detention pond, walk it, sit it, photograph it, sketch it, and enjoy it. If you have any questions, the city of Champaign owns the 2 ponds to the north, and the Park District owns the section to the south of the Springfield Avenue. And become a little more familiar with your prairie. It's down to the state having preserved 0.01% of the 2/3 of the state that was prairie. And when you're thinking of supporting the preservation of ecosystems in other countries, you might also think about your own ecosystem that is mainly corn and soybeans. The time has come when you have a little more time and a little more resource to visit your local prairies and to encourage their extension. And by so doing, you're encouraging the connectivity between small plots of prairie that have been reconstructed, like Meadowbrook Park, and giving the areas a connectivity for birds and bees and other creatures. So the more you think about master gardener and master naturalist, you think about combining these areas so that they will be available to creatures in the future. We're losing creatures at a very rapid rate.
14 minutes.
Okay. This week I was talking to Adrian Bauer on a cell phone, and she is in New Orleans and doing theatrical things, and I don't know how she's surviving at the moment because the virus has altered theatrical presentations and having people together. But it reminded me of a time when I enjoyed a different area, but it's another of these connectivity sites. It was Allerton Park, and Allerton Park I enjoyed. I had worked with it a lot. I sort of, its interpretation, I would take field trips there, and I'd make movies, and I was interested in the character of the south side, or the conservation side, where there was an area of prairie in amongst the woodlands, and the woodlands were actually coming back in and replacing the prairie with woodland. So there were researchers that were studying the invasion in a technical manner. At the time, I had access to the roads that went around the corridor to the Lost Garden, and I was aware that the University of Illinois, WILL, had vacated an engineering tower for broadcast. They went from a tower that had 4 legs to towers that had a point and were kept up by guy wires. And there was an engineering house associated with this, and I thought it could be a good visitor center. And I gradually wormed my way in. I'm not sure how I did it, but we had chairs and visual equipment and the opportunity for that to be a possible visitor center. I looked at the antenna and I was interested in the fact that you can put floors in various levels of antenna. You take off the top, but you let people get up high so that you can look over the ecosystem. And it was very interesting to go up there and look over the landscape and see the bottomlands all green and the uplands in fall to be yellow and red in fall color. So it was a little bit far away from the house. It was an inviting sight. There was even a place for a trailer and someone to stay, and a well and an access road. And there's this wonderful row of Norwegian spruce, and they had grown mature, and the bottom branches were out onto the road. Later, they all got popsicleized, and the bottom branches were removed. So, but at the time, it was rather inviting, and we were evil-minded. We had not yet got the Allerton Park had not yet got the associated heron rookery, and the Land Foundation is involved with Hannon and others had not acquired a nearby 69 acres of bottomland. So it was a little bit vulnerable to vandals, but it was a wonderful site. It still is. But we just got that far, and the liability people got involved, and it was decided that the aerial should be removed, and so explosives were put in the legs of each of the tower legs, and it was brought down, and the little house was demolished, but it was a tall aerial and a wonderful area. And I was standing there watching the results of the demolition, and a fellow came along and he explained that he and his wife, he was a specialist in these aerials, and he and his wife had spent their honeymoon putting this antenna up. And he, in the West, adapts these old-style antenna with spread legs to viewing devices, sometimes fire devices, so that people could climb up to a certain level and experience the ecosystems from above. We lost our opportunity for a possible visitor center, but it was enough to remind people that people do enjoy being told what to recognize and how to recognize it. So now the Allerton Park has changed. Sam Allerton bought the park in the Civil War when he was providing food for the Union Army, and there's a little place called Armenia where his farm buildings were and his farm workers lived, and we had again hoped that that would be a historic site. He gave the park to his son, who used it for many, many years, and then donated it to the University of Illinois. The university cultivated the adjacent farmland for to keep the house and grounds afloat, but more recently the complex has been split in two. There's a management for the house and house area, and the farmland has been contracted out, and that has meant that the Sam Allerton area has been assigned to agriculture because the contractual situation is very competitive, and we lost some original buildings that I would have liked to have saved. And recently, the wooden elevator there burned, and that for us was rather sad. Our little Heartland Pathways railroad bed goes past that elevator, and we facilitated its use till about 5 or 6 years ago. It was loaded with wood that we could never replace. Some of the beams were huge, cut from trees that we don't have anymore. And this was, for us, an icon. But there are different ways of looking at these things. So it is enough to remind you that you need to talk to each other and to make sure that people are aware of the possible multiple uses of some of these historic items.
2 minutes.
The other end of that corridor is a 2-mile trail that goes over the Sangamon River on a truss bridge that we own. And that is a very popular trail. It runs from the west side of Monticello on the east side of the Sangamon River across the Sangamon to County Farm Road, and then it has access to Allerton and it has access to Old Route 45. We could extend that, but at the moment that is also a prairie preservation site, and we have been reluctant to have a wide trail that would take out a lot of the prairie. So, but in time, we hope that will happen.
Thank you.
So, I think we're getting near to the end. This is an awkward time for everyone. So, keep well and. But still do interesting things.
There you go.
I'm working next door with an array of items that include the likes of the story about the visitor center attempt. We just have lots of information there which needs to be computerized and given to the public in an expressive manner. Some of it will go to archives at the Urbana Free Library, and we appreciate that. So this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.